The morning that changed everything. The sun rose slowly over Millersville Park, its golden rays filtering through a canopy of ancient oak trees. Birds chirped harmoniously, their songs blending with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Families were beginning to lay out picnic blankets. Joggers navigated the winding trails, and a group of kids kicked a soccer ball in the open field. Among the bustle of life was Jason Turner, a 14-year-old boy with a passion for sketching nature and a knack for wandering off into his own world. Jason, with his sketchpad tucked under his arm, strolled through the park's familiar paths. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, he had his earbuds in, humming softly to the music playing on his phone. He loved the park's tranquility, especially in the mornings. It was his retreat from the loud chaos of the world, a place where he felt connected to the beauty of life around him. Today was a special day. Jason's father, Sergeant Malcolm Turner, a highly respected officer in the Millersville Police Department, was assigned to patrol the park. It had become a sort of tradition for Jason to surprise his dad during his rounds. Seeing his father's face light up when Jason showed up was a moment of pure joy for them both. Jason's sneakers crunched softly against the gravel as he ventured toward the secluded area where his dad usually patrolled. His plan was simple: greet his dad, maybe grab a snack from the nearby food truck, and spend some time together before Malcolm's shift got too busy. But as he walked deeper into the quieter parts of the park, Jason began to notice something unusual. The lively buzz of the park was fading. Fewer joggers were on the trails, and the laughter of families felt distant. The atmosphere changed subtly. What was once welcoming and serene now felt cold and ominous. Jason shrugged it off, chalking it up to his overactive imagination. After all, this was his sanctuary. Nothing bad could happen here. As Jason rounded a corner near the wooded section of the park, he spotted a figure standing by a bench. The man wore a police uniform, but it wasn't his father. The officer stood rigidly, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Jason as he approached. Jason slowed his steps, feeling the weight of the officer's stare. "Hey there, kid," the officer barked, his tone sharp and commanding. "What are you doing back here?" Jason blinked, startled by the abruptness of the question. I'm just here to see my dad," he said, his voice steady but polite. "Sergeant Turner. He's on duty today." The officer's expression didn't soften. If anything, his features hardened, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Sergeant Turner, huh? Didn't know he had a kid." Jason nodded, taking a cautious step forward. "Yeah, I just wanted to surprise him." The officer chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Surprise him, pa? Kids like you think you can just waltz around here like you own the place." Jason frowned, confused by the hostility in the man's tone. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said carefully. "I'm just trying to." "Enough," the officer interrupted, taking a step closer. His imposing frame loomed over Jason, making him feel small. "Kids like you always think you're above the rules, don't you? Think your daddy's badge makes you special." Jason's cheeks flushed. "I'm not trying to be special," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to see my dad." The officer's sneer deepened. "Well, let me tell you something, boy. Out here, your daddy doesn't mean a damn thing." Jason took a step back, the unease in his chest turning into full-blown fear. He looked around, hoping to spot someone, anyone, who might help diffuse the tension. But the trail was empty, and the quiet woods seemed to swallow his silent plea for help. "You scared now?" the officer taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not so tough when someone puts you in your place, huh?" Jason opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He felt trapped, unsure of what to do or say. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The officer's presence was suffocating, his gaze unrelenting. The officer stepped even closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. Jason's pulse quickened as the man's towering figure loomed over him. "You need to learn some respect," the officer hissed. "And I'm just the guy to teach you." Before Jason could react, the officer's attention shifted. His gaze locked on something in the grass a few feet away, and his smirk turned into something far more sinister. Well, he muttered, more to himself than to Jason. Looks like we got ourselves a little friend. Jason followed the officer's gaze and froze. A massive python was coiled in the tall grass, its patterned scales glistening in the sunlight. The snake's head lifted, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. Fear gripped Jason's chest like a vice. He had always been terrified of snakes, and the sight of this one, a creature far larger than any he'd ever seen, left him paralyzed. He turned back to the officer, expecting him to take control of the situation. But instead of stepping in to protect Jason, the man's twisted grin widened. "Why don't you go say hello?" the officer said, his tone laced with malice. Jason's eyes widened in horror. "No, please," he said quickly, his voice shaking. "I don't want to." But the officer wasn't listening. He reached out, grabbing Jason by the shoulder with a force that made the boy wince. Then, with a sudden shove, he pushed Jason forward, straight toward the python. Jason stumbled, his feet slipping on the gravel as he fell to the ground just a few feet from the snake. The python's head turned, its dark eyes locking onto him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The world around him faded into silence, and all he could see was the massive creature before him. Then the python began to move. Jason scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the ground. But the snake was faster. Its muscular body uncoiled with terrifying speed, and within seconds it lunged toward him. The last thing Jason saw before the python's coils wrapped around his legs was the officer's cruel smirk, his arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold like a twisted spectator at a gladiator match. The peaceful morning Jason had envisioned was gone. In its place was a nightmare that would change his life forever. A father's fury. The python's cold, muscular body wrapped around Jason's legs, pinning him to the ground. He thrashed and clawed at the dirt, desperate to free himself, but the snake's grip was unyielding. Panic surged through him as the python's coils tightened, inching higher with every passing second. Jason gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe, his fear rising to an unbearable crescendo. "Help!" he screamed, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his face. "Somebody, please." The officer, standing just a few feet away, watched with twisted amusement. His arms were crossed, his stance relaxed, as though he were observing a casual afternoon spectacle. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jason to hear. "Can't even handle a little snake." Jason's heart pounded in his ears, his vision blurring as the python constricted further. He thought of his father, his strong, protective dad who had always assured him that no harm would ever come to him. Where was he now? Jason's mind screamed for his father, for the man who could make this nightmare go away. The officer took a step closer, crouching down to meet Jason's terrified gaze. "What's the matter, kid?" "Snake caught your tongue." His smirk deepened, the malice in his eyes evident. "Maybe this'll teach you a little respect." Jason couldn't respond. The python's powerful body had reached his chest, its coils tightening with relentless force. His breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and his strength was rapidly fading. Every attempt to move only seemed to anger the snake further, its grip like iron around his frail frame. Just when Jason thought he couldn't take any more, a booming voice shattered the suffocating silence. "Jason." The voice was sharp, commanding, and unmistakable. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he craned his neck, his tear-filled eyes darting toward the sound. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was his father, Sergeant Malcolm Turner. His broad shoulders and tall frame seemed even more imposing as he took in the scene before him. His piercing eyes locked on Jason, then shifted to the officer and the python in a single furious sweep. Malcolm's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he stormed forward. "What the hell is going on here?" The officer's smug demeanor faltered for the first time. He stood up straight, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Captain Turner," he began, his tone feigning innocence. "I was just." "Step back," Malcolm roared, his voice echoing through the clearing. It was not a request. It was a command. The officer froze, visibly startled by Malcolm's intensity. Without waiting for compliance, Malcolm dropped to his knees beside Jason, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. He grabbed a sturdy branch nearby, wedging it between the python's coils and Jason's chest. "Hold on, son," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the fear simmering beneath. "I've got you." Jason whimpered, his small hands gripping his father's arm weakly. "Dad, I can't. Breathe. You're going to be okay," Malcolm assured him, his voice resolute. With a grunt of effort, he pried at the snake's grip, forcing the coils to loosen. The python hissed, its powerful body resisting Malcolm's strength, but he refused to relent. The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he mumbled, but his words were weak and insincere. "Shut your mouth," Malcolm growled, not even sparing him a glance. His focus was entirely on his son. With one final powerful shove, Malcolm managed to free Jason from the python's crushing hold. The snake recoiled, slithering back into the tall grass, its massive body disappearing into the underbrush. Malcolm pulled Jason into his arms, cradling him as he checked for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Malcolm asked, his voice soft now, filled with concern. Jason shook his head weakly, his breathing still labored. I'm okay," he whispered, though his trembling body said otherwise. Malcolm exhaled deeply, relief washing over him as he held his son close. But that relief was short-lived. He turned his attention to the officer, his expression hardening into a mask of righteous fury. "What the hell were you thinking?" Malcolm demanded, rising to his feet while keeping Jason securely in his grasp. "You stood there and let this happen. You pushed my son toward that snake." The officer stammered, his earlier bravado crumbling under Malcolm's glare. I didn't push him." He stumbled, "That's all. I thought he'd be fine." "Don't lie to me." Malcolm snapped, his voice like thunder. "I saw you standing there, watching my son fight for his life, while you did nothing. You think this is a joke?" The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of Malcolm's anger was palpable, an unyielding force that left no room for excuses. Jason, still clutching his father's arm, looked up at the man who had tormented him. He laughed. Jason said, his voice trembling. "He told me to say hello to the snake." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists, his entire body tensing as Jason's words sank in. He took a step toward the officer, his presence towering and unrelenting. "You think you can treat people like this?" Malcolm hissed. "You think you can endanger a child and walk away without consequences?" "I didn't mean," the officer began, but Malcolm cut him off. "Save it," Malcolm barked, pulling out his radio. "This is Sergeant Malcolm Turner. I need backup at Millersville Park. Officer misconduct. Code red." The officer's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. "Wait, hold on. You don't have to do that." "Shut up," Malcolm snarled. "You're done." Within minutes, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the air. 2 officers arrived, their expressions grim as they took in the scene. Malcolm handed Jason to one of them, instructing them to check him for further injuries. Then he turned back to the offending officer. "You're under arrest for endangering the life of a minor and gross misconduct," one of the arriving officers said coldly, snapping handcuffs onto the man's wrists. The officer struggled weakly, his protests drowned out by Malcolm's icy glare. "You'll regret this, Turner," the man spat as he was led away. "You're making a big mistake." "The only mistake," Malcolm said quietly, his voice laced with steel, "was thinking you could get away with this." As the officers disappeared down the trail, Malcolm knelt back down beside Jason. He placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his expression softening. "It's over now," he said gently. You're safe." Jason nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You saved me." Malcolm pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him close as the weight of the ordeal finally began to lift. "I'll always protect you," Malcolm said, his voice filled with unwavering resolve. "Always." But as they sat together on the forest floor, Malcolm knew this was far from over. Justice would be served, not just for Jason, but for anyone who had ever suffered at the hands of a man like that officer. And Malcolm would make damn sure of it. The aftermath. Jason sat on a bench near the park entrance, a scratchy thermal blanket wrapped around his small frame. He clutched a water bottle in his trembling hands, staring down at the gravel path beneath his sneakers. The park's usual cheerful atmosphere now felt muted, almost surreal. The sounds of children laughing in the distance, joggers' rhythmic footsteps, and chirping birds seemed to belong to another world, one that Jason no longer felt a part of. His father, Sergeant Malcolm Turner, knelt beside him, his firm hands resting on Jason's shoulders. Malcolm's presence had always been a source of comfort for Jason, but today it felt like a lifeline. The warmth and strength in Malcolm's touch helped tether Jason to reality, keeping the memories of the python's coils and the officer's sneering face at bay. "Jason," Malcolm said gently, his voice steady but tinged with worry. "I need you to tell me everything. From the moment you saw him until I got there." Jason hesitated, his throat tightening as he remembered the encounter. The officer's mocking tone, his menacing words, the cold sensation of the python's scales against his skin. It all came flooding back. Jason blinked rapidly, trying to fight back the tears threatening to spill over. Malcolm squeezed Jason's shoulder reassuringly. "Take your time, son. I'm here." Jason took a shaky breath, nodding. I was walking to find you," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him standing by the bench. He looked at me funny, like he didn't want me there." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, allowing Jason to continue. "I told him I was looking for you," Jason said, his words spilling out in a rush now. "But he started saying things, mean things. He said I thought I was special because you're a cop. But I wasn't trying to be special, Dad. I just—" Jason's voice cracked, and he looked away, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Malcolm's heart ached seeing his son like this. Jason, his bright, kind, and curious boy, didn't deserve any of this. "I know, Jason," Malcolm said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault." Jason sniffled, nodding but still avoiding his father's gaze. He kept saying I needed to learn respect," Jason continued. "Then he saw the snake. He told me to go say hi to it. When I said no, he pushed me." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The officer's actions were not only reckless but outright malicious. His mind raced with anger and disbelief, but he forced himself to stay calm. Right now, Jason needed a father, not a raging officer. "He just stood there," Jason said, his voice trembling. "He laughed while it wrapped around me. I thought I was going to die." At that, Jason finally broke, his tears flowing freely as he buried his face in his father's chest. Malcolm wrapped his arms around him, holding him close as his son's body shook with sobs. "You're safe now, Jason," Malcolm murmured, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "He'll never hurt you or anyone else again, I promise." As Jason's sobs subsided, Malcolm's radio crackled to life. "Sergeant Turner, this is dispatch. We need you to return to the station for an urgent debrief regarding the incident." Malcolm sighed, reluctant to leave Jason's side so soon. He glanced up to see Officer Carla Jenkins, a trusted colleague, approaching them. Carla had responded to the scene after Malcolm's call for backup and had taken the offending officer into custody. "I've got him," Carla said softly, kneeling down beside Jason. She offered a warm smile that seemed to ease some of the tension in Jason's shoulders. "Hey, kiddo, you've been through a lot today, huh?" Jason nodded, his grip on Malcolm's arm loosening slightly. Carla looked up at Malcolm. "Go. I'll stay with him until you're done." Malcolm hesitated, his protective instincts screaming at him not to leave Jason's side. But he trusted Carla, and the situation demanded his attention. He kissed Jason's forehead and rose to his feet. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Carla's got you, okay?" Jason nodded again, watching as his father walked away, his broad shoulders tense with determination. The police station buzzed with activity as Malcolm entered the briefing room. Several officers were already gathered, their expressions grim. At the head of the room stood Chief Elena Vargas, a no-nonsense leader known for her integrity and commitment to justice. "Sergeant Turner," Chief Vargas said, motioning for him to join her. "We've reviewed the preliminary report, and I'd just spoken with Internal Affairs. This is serious." Malcolm nodded, his face a mask of resolve. "What's the status of the officer?" Chief Vargas sighed, folding her arms. "Officer Darren Wyatt has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Given the eyewitness accounts and Jason's statement, this case will likely escalate to criminal charges." "Good," Malcolm said, his voice cold. "He endangered my son's life. He shouldn't be wearing a badge." Chief Vargas nodded. "I agree. But you know how these things go. We need to be thorough and ensured every step is by the book." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He hated the slow grind of bureaucracy, but he also knew Chief Vargas was right. They couldn't afford any mistakes, not when Jason's safety and dignity were on the line. "What else can I do?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady. Chief Vargas placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be there for your son. This is going to be a long process, and he's going to need you more than ever." Back at the park, Carla had coaxed a small smile from Jason by showing him photos of her rescue dog, Max. The boy's shoulders were still tense, but the terror in his eyes had dulled slightly. "You know," Carla said, handing Jason a granola bar, "your dad is one of the toughest, most dedicated officers I've ever worked with. He's like a force of nature." Jason unwrapped the bar slowly, his hand still trembling. "I know," he said quietly. "He's always protecting everyone." Carla smiled, leaning in closer. "And today, he showed that nothing matters more to him than protecting you." Jason nodded, a small flicker of gratitude warming his chest. For the first time since the incident, he felt a faint sense of safety returning. But deep down, he couldn't shake the memory of the officer's sneer or the suffocating grip of the python. Those moments would stay with him for a long time, and he wasn't sure how to face them. As Carla continued talking, Jason glanced at the path his father had taken, hoping he'd return soon. The thought of his dad standing up for him, ensuring justice was served, gave Jason a glimmer of hope that the nightmare might one day feel like a distant memory. But for now, the scars remained fresh, and Jason knew his journey to healing was just beginning. Unmasking the system. Back at the police station, Malcolm Turner sat across from Chief Elena Vargas in her dimly lit office. The blinds were drawn, blocking the late afternoon sun, and the air felt heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. A thick file sat on the desk between them, its contents a damning record of Officer Darren Wyatt's past conduct. "This isn't his first offense," Chief Vargas said, her voice low but firm. She pushed the file toward Malcolm, her expression grim. "We've had complaints, allegations of excessive force, intimidation, and discriminatory behavior, but nothing concrete enough to stick. Until now." Malcolm's jaw tightened as he flipped through the file. The incidents detailed within painted a chilling picture of a man unfit to wear a badge. "How has he stayed on the force this long?" Malcolm demanded, his voice laced with anger. "How has no one stopped him?" Chief Vargas leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow, tired sigh. "You know how it goes, Malcolm. People don't speak up. They're afraid of retaliation, and when they do, the system drags its feet. Internal investigations get buried under paperwork, and officers like Wyatt get shuffled around instead of held accountable. Malcolm slammed the file shut, the sound echoing in the small office. Well, not this time. Not with what he did to my son. Chief Vargas met his gaze, her expression softening. I don't blame you for being furious. If it were my child. I feel the same way. But we have to handle this by the book. Wyatt's actions are indefensible, and this time, we have evidence, witnesses, your report, Jason's testimony. We'll make sure he's held accountable. Malcolm nodded, though his fists remained clenched at his sides. I'm not just doing this for Jason, he said. I'm doing it for everyone Wyatt has ever hurt, and for the people he could hurt if we don't stop him. Meanwhile, Jason sat in the living room of their small but cozy home, staring blankly at the television. The cartoons playing on the screen did little to distract him from the memories that kept replaying in his mind. The snake's cold, unyielding coils, the officer's sneer, his mocking words. Jason's mom, Lisa Turner, sat beside him, her hand gently stroking his back. She had come home early from work the moment she heard what had happened, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a fierce protectiveness. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, Lisa said softly. But if you do, I'm here to listen. Jason nodded, his eyes still fixed on the screen. I told Dad everything, he said quietly. He's going to make sure that officer can't hurt anyone else. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. Your dad won't stop until justice is served. You know that. Jason turned to her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. What if it's not enough? What if that man just gets another job somewhere else and does this to someone else? Lisa's heart ached at the fear and doubt in her son's voice. She wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. Your dad is fighting for you. And so am I. We won't let this go. Jason nodded, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. He leaned against his mom, finding solace in her embrace even as his mind remained restless. Later that evening, Malcolm returned home, his face lined with exhaustion, but his resolve as strong as ever. Lisa greeted him at the door, her expression a mix of relief and concern. How's Jason? Malcolm asked immediately. Lisa gestured toward the living room, where Jason was curled up on the couch, fast asleep. He's been quiet. I think he's trying to process everything. Malcolm sighed, running a hand over his face. I'm going to make sure that officer pays for what he did. But it's not just about Wyatt. This whole system needs to change. Lisa nodded, her gaze steady. I know, and I'll support you every step of the way. Malcolm leaned against the counter, his thoughts heavy. Vargas showed me Wyatt's file. He's had complaints before, plenty of them. But nothing ever came of it. It's like the system protects him instead of the people he's supposed to serve. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Then it's time to shine a light on that system. If they've been covering for him, they need to be exposed. The next day, Malcolm sat down with a local reporter, Emily Hart, who had a reputation for uncovering corruption. They met at a small cafe away from the prying eyes of the station. Emily was sharp, her notepad and recorder ready as she listened to Malcolm's account of the incident. This isn't just about what happened to Jason, Malcolm said, his voice steady but passionate. It's about every person who's been hurt by officers like Wyatt. It's about holding the entire system accountable. Emily nodded, her pen flying across the page. And you're willing to go on record with this? Malcolm didn't hesitate. Absolutely. I won't let this get swept under the rug. Emily leaned forward, her gaze intense. You know this won't be easy. Speaking out against one of your own, against the system you're part of, it's going to make waves. Are you ready for that? Malcolm met her gaze without flinching. I don't care about the waves. I care about justice, for my son and for everyone else who's been hurt. Back at the Turner home, Jason sat at the kitchen table with his sketchpad, trying to lose himself in drawing. He sketched the park's trees, the winding trails, the sunlight filtering through the leaves. But no matter how hard he tried, The image of the python kept creeping into his mind, its coils replacing the roots of the trees, its dark eyes staring back at him. Lisa noticed his frustration and sat down beside him. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" Jason shrugged. "Just trying to draw something. But it keeps turning into the snake." Lisa reached out, placing a comforting hand on his. "You don't have to forget what happened," she said gently. "But you can take that fear and turn it into something stronger." Jason looked up at her, his eyes questioning. "Like what?" "Like courage," Lisa said. "You faced something terrifying, Jason, and you came through it. That makes you stronger than you think." Jason's grip on his pencil tightened, a small spark of determination flickering in his chest. "I just want to feel normal again." "You will," Lisa said with certainty. "It'll take time, but you will." As Jason returned to his sketch, he felt a glimmer of hope. His father was fighting for justice, his mom was by his side, and slowly he was beginning to see a path forward. That night, as Malcolm sat in his home office reviewing more of Wyatt's file, a notification popped up on his phone. Emily Hart's article had just been published. The headline read, "A System Unchecked. How One Officer's Actions Expose a Deeper Problem in Millersville's Police Department." Malcolm's lips pressed into a grim smile. The fight was far from over, but this was a start. As he closed the file and turned off his computer, he glanced at a photo of Jason on his desk. It was from happier times, a picture of his son laughing, carefree. "We'll get back to that," Malcolm whispered. "I promise." Standing together, Jason stared at his sketchpad, pencil poised above the page. He'd been sitting at the dining table for over an hour, trying to draw something that didn't remind him of that python or the officer's sneer. The memories clung to him like an unwanted shadow, their weight pressing down on his shoulders. Across the room, his mom, Lisa, watched him quietly, her hands busy peeling carrots for dinner. She could see the tension in his small frame, the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward and his hands fidgeted. Jason had always been an expressive child, pouring his emotions into his art. But now his silence spoke louder than any words could. "Jason," she said gently, breaking the stillness, "want to help me with dinner?" Jason glanced up, his eyes tired. "Not really," he muttered. Lisa wiped her hands on a towel and walked over to him. She crouched beside his chair, meeting his gaze. "You know, I've been thinking," she began. "You're one of the bravest people I know." Jason frowned. "Brave?" "I was terrified. I couldn't do anything." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Lisa said. "It means you keep going, even when you are." "And you did, Jason. You faced something most people never would. And you're still here." Jason's lips quirked up in a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't feel brave." Lisa rested her hand on his. "You don't have to feel it to be it." Jason nodded slowly, her words sinking in. But before he could say anything, the sound of the front door opening drew their attention. Malcolm walked in, his expression as heavy as the day's events. "How'd it go?" Lisa asked, standing up to greet him. Malcolm sighed, placing his keys on the counter. "The investigation is moving forward, but it's slow. Wyatt's lawyer is already pushing back, claiming it was a misunderstanding." Lisa's jaw tightened. A misunderstanding. "He shoved our son into a python and mocked him while he nearly suffocated." Malcolm held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. "I know, Lisa. Believe me, I know. But the legal system doesn't always work as fast as we want. That's why I spoke to Emily Hart. Her article's already making waves." Jason perked up at that. "What kind of waves?" Malcolm smiled at him, though it was tinged with weariness. "People are talking, son. They're angry, and they should be. This isn't just about you. It's about holding people like Wyatt accountable." Jason straightened in his chair. "What can I do?" Lisa and Malcolm exchanged a look. Malcolm knelt down to meet Jason's gaze, his eyes steady. "Right now, The best thing you can do is keep being strong. But if you want, you can tell your story. It might help other people understand why this matters so much." Jason hesitated, his fingers gripping his pencil tightly. The thought of reliving that day, of putting it all into words, was daunting. But then he thought about the other kids Wyatt might have hurt, or could hurt in the future. If his story could stop that, maybe it was worth it. "I'll do it," Jason said quietly. "I want to help." Malcolm smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's my boy." The next morning, the Turners found themselves in the living room with Emily Hart. Jason sat on the couch, his hands folded in his lap, as Emily set up her recording equipment. Lisa sat beside him, her presence a calming force, while Malcolm leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. Emily offered Jason a kind smile. "No pressure, Jason. You don't have to say anything you're not comfortable with." Jason nodded. "I'm ready." Emily hit record, and Jason began. His voice was quiet at first, but as he recounted the events of that day, his words grew stronger. He described the officer's mocking tone, the shove that sent him toward the snake, and the helplessness he felt as the python wrapped around him. By the time he finished, tears welled in Lisa's eyes, and Malcolm's fists were clenched at his sides. "You're incredibly brave, Jason," Emily said softly. "Thank you for sharing that." Jason looked down at his hands, his face flushed. "I just don't want him to hurt anyone else." Emily nodded. "That's exactly why your story is so important." The following week, Emily's new article went live, accompanied by a video of Jason's testimony. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the community and beyond. Parents, activists, and even fellow officers expressed outrage at Wyatt's actions and called for systemic change within the police department. Rallies were organized, and people gathered in front of the Millersville Police Department, holding signs that read "Justice for Jason" and "No badge for bullies." Malcolm attended each one, standing shoulder to shoulder with the people demanding accountability. For the first time, Jason felt something shift inside him. The fear and shame he'd carried since that day began to fade, replaced by a sense of empowerment. He wasn't alone. His story had sparked something bigger than himself. At one rally, Jason stood beside his father, holding a sign that read, "Kids deserve safety, not fear." The crowd cheered as Malcolm stepped up to the microphone, his voice ringing out over the sea of people. "This isn't just about my son," Malcolm said, his tone resolute. "It's about every person who's ever been mistreated by those sworn to protect them. It's about creating a system that holds people accountable, no matter their rank or title. And it's about making sure no parent ever has to experience what I did that day." The crowd erupted into applause, their chants growing louder. Jason looked up at his father, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope that change was possible. As the rally continued, Jason felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a boy about his age holding a sign of his own. "Hi," the boy said shyly. "I saw your video. What happened to you? It wasn't right. I'm glad you spoke up." Jason smiled, his heart lifting. "Thanks. It was scary, but my dad says sometimes you have to do the hard stuff to make things better." The boy nodded. "You're brave. I don't think I could have done that." Jason thought about his mom's words. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you keep going anyway. The boy grinned. "That's cool. I'll remember that." As the rally wound down, Jason stood with his family, feeling lighter than he had in days. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he believed they could win. Together, they were stronger than any fear, any python, or any corrupt officer. Together, they could make a difference. The resolution. The courthouse was packed. Every seat was filled, and the walls were lined with people standing shoulder to shoulder. Some were there for Jason, others to support accountability within the police force, and still more out of sheer curiosity. Reporters with notepads and cameras jostled for position, whispering among themselves as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Jason sat between his parents, his small frame dwarfed by the towering presence of his father on one side and the calming support of his mother on the other. He clutched Lisa's hand tightly, his heart pounding as he glanced around the courtroom. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the hearing that would determine Officer Darren Wyatt's fate. Malcolm leaned down and whispered in Jason's ear, his voice steady and reassuring. "No matter what happens today, you've already made a difference. Remember that." Jason nodded, though his chest felt tight with anxiety. He looked up at the judge, a stern-faced woman who exuded authority, as she entered the room and called for silence. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood, and the judge settled into her seat. "This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to pursue charges against Officer Darren Wyatt for gross misconduct, endangerment of a minor, and abuse of power," she began, her tone firm. "The court recognizes the severity of these allegations and will weigh the evidence accordingly." Jason's grip on his mother's hand tightened. Lisa gave him a small, encouraging smile, her other hand resting lightly on his knee. The prosecution began with a clear and damning presentation of the case. Witnesses testified about Wyatt's history of aggression and misconduct. Emily Hart's articles and video interviews, including Jason's, were entered into evidence. A few of Wyatt's former colleagues took the stand, recounting incidents where his behavior had crossed the line. But it was Malcolm's testimony that silenced the courtroom. He described the events of that day in vivid detail. The moment he arrived to find his son trapped in the coils of the python, the officer's indifference, and the sheer terror etched on Jason's face. His voice, usually steady and commanding, cracked as he spoke about the fear of almost losing his child. "My son is here today because I arrived just in time," Malcolm said, his voice ringing with emotion. "But the question we need to ask is why Wyatt thought this was acceptable in the first place. This isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about a culture that allowed him to believe he could act without consequence." When Malcolm finished, the room was eerily quiet. Even the defense team seemed rattled. Jason knew his turn was coming. His name was called, and Malcolm gave him an encouraging nod as he walked to the witness stand. The judge leaned forward, her expression softening slightly as she addressed him. "Jason, you've been very brave to come here today," she said. "Take your time and speak in your own words." Jason swallowed hard and looked out at the room filled with strangers. His eyes landed on his parents, their presence anchoring him. He took a deep breath. "I was scared," Jason began, his voice shaking at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I didn't know why he was so angry at me. I just wanted to see my dad. But he kept saying things, mean things, and then he pushed me toward the snake." Jason paused, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. "He didn't help me. He just stood there and laughed. I thought I was going to die." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Jason continued, his voice steady now. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did that day. Scared and alone. That's why I told my story. So it wouldn't happen again." When Jason finished, the judge thanked him, and he returned to his seat, his parents pulling him into a quiet embrace. The defense tried to paint Wyatt's actions as a misjudged joke, claiming he hadn't intended for Jason to be in real danger. But their arguments faltered in the face of overwhelming evidence and testimony. By the time closing statements were made, the mood in the courtroom was heavy with expectation. The judge took a recess to deliberate, and the room buzzed with whispered conversations. Jason sat quietly, his head resting against his father's arm. Malcolm's steady hand on his shoulder was a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. After reviewing the evidence and testimony presented, she began, her voice clear and authoritative. "This court finds sufficient grounds to move forward with charges against Officer Darren Wyatt. His actions were not only a gross violation of his duty as a law enforcement officer, but also endangered the life of a child. The defendant will be remanded into custody pending trial. The room erupted into applause, though Jason hardly registered the noise. Relief flooded through him, leaving him feeling both lighter and exhausted. Malcolm wrapped an arm around Jason's shoulders, his voice filled with pride. "You did it, son. You stood up, and it mattered." In the weeks that followed, Wyatt's case became a turning point for the Millersville Police Department. Policies were reviewed, and training programs were revamped to emphasize accountability and ethics. Malcolm was invited to lead workshops on community engagement and officer conduct, a role he accepted with determination. Jason's life slowly returned to a new normal. The nightmares of that day became less frequent, and his sketchpad began to fill with images of hope and strength. Trees with roots intertwined, hands clasped together, and even a triumphant figure standing tall against a coiled python. One afternoon, as Jason and Malcolm walked through Millersville Park, Jason paused at the bench where it all began. He stared at the spot, his expression unreadable. "Dad," Jason said after a moment, "can we sit here?" Malcolm nodded, and they sat side by side, the autumn breeze rustling the leaves around them. Jason pulled out his sketchpad and began to draw. "What are you working on?" Malcolm asked, leaning over to see. Jason smiled faintly, his pencil moving with confidence. "A new memory," he said, "one where I'm not afraid anymore." Malcolm's chest swelled with pride. "You're stronger than you know, Jason." Jason looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "Maybe, but I think it's because you and Mom are always here for me." Malcolm ruffled his hair, laughing softly. "That's never going to change." As the sun set over the park, casting the trees in a golden glow, Jason felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. The fear and pain of that day hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had become part of a story. His story of resilience, family, and the unwavering belief that justice, no matter how hard fought, was always worth pursuing.